The town of Silent Hill is built on subjectivity. When it comes to both the fog world and the other world, many elements of it are dependent on past experiences, attitudes, and even the sins of the people stuck within. While there are many points of crossover, each victim's experience seems to be unique to the point where, theoretically, the town knows the victims better than themselves. It's what's so alluring and scary about these games. Everyone has a different experience in Silent Hill, which results in a radical subjectivity that is similar to what you can find in a dream. When I rolled credits on Silent Hill 2, I was very surprised that the critical reception for this game wasn't like the town it was based on. I felt like all of what I had learned to value in any video game caused me to have a great time with Silent Hill 2, where I thought many other people wouldn't. That might have been a bit confusing, so let me put it in a more straightforward way. I am honestly a bit surprised by this game's critical reception. It's gotten very positive reviews from critics and even more positive reviews from players. It currently has an 86 on Metacritic and an overwhelmingly positive on Steam. In contrast to this, I think Silent Hill 2 is a very lopsided experience. On one hand, I was enthralled for most of the game, and I love so many aspects of it, and the journey James went on, I will never forget. It is thought-provoking, deep, and meaningful. But, on the other hand, the game has very obvious and borderline disruptive faults. It is confusing, shallow, and frustrating. This made me expect more people to feel conflicted about this game, and while that divisiveness never came to fruition for one big reason, I think it should have. Because as good as this game can be, and as much as I love this game, it is not a game I can universally recommend. If someone came up to me and asked me if they should play this game, I would ask them 3 questions in return. How much can you tolerate ambiguity? How well can you tolerate repetition? And do you have the patience to meet Silent Hill 2 on its own terms? If you are like me and have both the tolerance and the patience, you will love this game. For the third time, I loved this game, but in all aspects of Silent Hill 2, which includes story, combat, puzzles, and gameplay systems, there are areas of frustration, and some aspects have that frustration more than others. And that makes this game a bit complicated to talk about. This video will spoil the entire game, and somewhat assume you've already played it, although I will try to recap most of what happens when it's appropriate. But if you can, and are interested, try to play the game yourself before watching this video. Silent Hill 2 is not just any survival horror game. That means a lot coming from me because I love survival horror when it's done right, so trust me when I say this one's special, for better or for worse. Silent Hill 2 has some great survival horror gameplay, but also has some really frustrating moments and mechanics. In regards to the survival horror genre as a whole, there's some that I would say are deeper experiences than others. It's hard to generalize such a diverse set of games, but my favorite survival horror titles aren't just about surviving, they're about exploring, solving puzzles, and unraveling a story. How they practically work is that you have a limited, confined space where not every door is unlocked and you have to figure out where to go next. It's like one giant maze that you have to navigate while trying not to die. All while a pool of limited resources taunts you as you do your best to not unload an entire magazine of whatever gun you are using into this monstrous enemy right in front of you. If you don't manage your resources well, you will die, and maybe even make things more difficult for yourself later. The games test your brain more than it tests your combat ability, and to me, it's way more thrilling to figure out any of the puzzles scattered around you than it is to fight the enemies. These games feel like a balancing act of many different mechanics, with a sense of constant dread or fear being the tightrope that you're walking on, while your end goal is whatever plot device you're currently invested in. In other words, things like combat and survival can play a key part in these games, but I always thought that survival horror was more about the world around you than what you specifically encounter in the unknown. The closer the enemies feel like they interact with and are a part of the world, the better the game is. For example, in Resident Evil, enemies serve as roadblocks. I have to carefully consider where they are, can I avoid them, and what resources would I use to defeat them. Sometimes I have to consider even running away. Another example of enemies and the world interacting in a meaningful way is in Dead Space, where each gun that you get functions as a different way to kill your enemies, whether that's carving their limbs off or just blowing them to smithereens. With upgrades as your reward for exploring, it hits a similar beat as Resident Evil, where I am making choices based on limited resources that I find in the world around me. All this to say that when comparing Silent Hill 2 to what I think is the best of the genre, the game is a mixed bag when it comes to how the world, combat, and puzzles all interact with each other. The basic overarching thesis of this section is that Silent Hill 2 does not do this blending of enemies and world as well as other survival horror games. With a few exceptions, it very much feels like exploration and combat are divorced. Rather than feel tied to the world itself, I have to take a step out of exploring Silent Hill and face the enemy in front of me. Navigating this world is amazing, and yet combat felt like a deterrent from spending time in the playable area given to you. Instead of there being this overarching relationship between the enemies and the world found in other games, combat only exists because there needs to be some sort of threat for you to fight. When I dove deep into why I felt this way, my first reason was due to the heavy presence of melee combat. When you're interacting with an enemy, there's this very obvious attempt to make combat like a one-on-one duel between you and the opponent, especially when you're using a melee weapon. What this does, though, is shift your focus from the world around you to the enemy that's right in front of you. It's like zooming into this deathmatch where all you're now focused on is killing your enemy. Oftentimes this looks like waiting for an attack, dodging that attack, then swinging twice, and repeating that pattern over and over again. If you have the resources, you can shoot the enemy instead, but you're still in relatively close proximity thanks to the spaces being designed around close quarters confrontation, and if you're not careful, enemies can close the gap fast. It ultimately may be unintentional, but it leads to you shutting out your surroundings, which means you're experiencing Silent Hill 2 as two separate games. This feeling wouldn't be so strong if you can run away from enemy encounters fairly easily. In many other survival horror games, recognizing that you don't have the resources or ability to deal with whatever enemy is in front of you and booking it until you can find a better strategy is a good thing. But running away in Silent Hill was only an option some of the time. I found it to be very dependent on what type of enemy you were facing and where. Running away was so rare that I barely recall doing so in my main playthrough. It was always easier to either fight or avoid encounters altogether, since turning your back on an enemy once you engage with them might just be a death sentence. And during those times that I was forced to fight, it felt like my enemy would lock onto me. So what's the issue here? Swapping between two different games at once doesn't sound too terrible. Well, I could probably tolerate this feeling of two separate identities if combat wasn't so simple. This simplicity leads to a lot of unsatisfying gameplay, and I would even call the combat in this game the worst part about it. It really doesn't have many bells and whistles. There's a melee attack, a dodge, and your 3 ranged weapons that you get over a 15-hour journey. All these things combine to having one thing on my mind during combat, and that's when should I dodge? Which isn't a bad thing to think by itself, since many games can and do mix up when you're expected to dodge quite frequently, but it is a bad thing in Silent Hill 2 because the game doesn't have the depth to make dodging interesting. There are 4 main enemy types throughout this game. The lying figures, which I called the spitters, the mannequins, which I called the hiders, the mandarins, which I called the stompers, and the bubblehead nurses, which I called surprisingly accurately the nurses. 1 out of 4 correct. Go me wins a win. These enemies don't have many attacks. I counted 2, and a special grab for each of them, and once you learn how to avoid everything and what they throw at you, the game's mechanics wear pretty thin. I figured out the timing of their attacks within the first few encounters with the enemy, which made them a chore to fight, especially the stompers. They are legitimately the worst, and dealing with those things might be one of the most frustrating and unfun gaming experiences I have ever had, and I very frequently and willingly play Rainbow Six Siege. Combat lacking depth provides a feedback loop to the world around you. What I mean is that resource use and decision making in combat is so barbaric and simple that any resource gathering feels completely meaningless. In the beginning, ammo feels like free passes to not engage with enemies by melee. This isn't ideal, but at least ammo felt meaningful, because you need those get out of jail free cards when you're just getting used to the melee combat. But ammo's role changes a bit as the game progresses. By the end of the game, you'll be using guns almost exclusively, and suddenly, any interesting decisions are taken away from you. You'll want to pick up ammo no matter what, since there is no inventory system. You'll never have to choose between what ammo to prioritize because there's always going to be room for more. You can carry all 3 guns at once and switch between them at any time. There's nothing pushing me to make more complex decisions in Silent Hill 2. It's all about this very basic pattern recognition to mitigate resource use, and less about collecting and smartly managing resources in the world around you. And to me, that's a big mistake. It's so big of a mistake that it's one of the biggest contributing factors to why I was so shocked that this game got such a good reception. Before we move on to the different and better parts of Silent Hill 2, I think it's important to recognize that combat does do one thing right. There is no better feeling than killing an enemy in this game. When you knock down an enemy and start hitting them over and over again because you want to make sure they're dead, it's easy to get carried away since the aesthetics of combat are so pleasing. The sounds of the enemies, the sounds of James as he swings, the enemy designs themselves, all invoked terror, and for a while the only thing I was concerned with was beating whatever freaky thing that was dancing in front of me. Because of this positive quality, which I noticed somewhere around the halfway point, I came to realize what the true nature of this game's combat is. The true nature of Silent Hill 2's combat is a gamble. It is effective only if you are feeling fear. In fact, it is relying on you being scared out of your mind. But once that fear evaporates, it becomes a bit of a slog to get through. It puts all its chips on making sure you don't realize how shallow it really is by making you feel terror. The most damning evidence of this is in New Game Plus. Upon starting the game again, early on it gives you a chainsaw that does major damage to enemies that are within reach. So far, in my New Game Plus run, it is a cheat code for passing encounters, and there's obviously part of me that really likes this. I wouldn't want to go through the progressions of getting more powerful weapons again, because if I had to fight the same enemies over and over again, in the exact same way, in the exact same situations, there is no way I would ever finish this game again. But at the same time, it's kind of like admitting that your combat system isn't enjoyable on multiple playthroughs. I get that Silent Hill 2 has bigger and better qualities, but combat is such an integral part of this game, and it can get dreadful. I can't deny that the game would be boring without these threats I'm so brutally critiquing, so I'm not saying enemies should be removed. Combat is an essential component to the atmosphere. It's necessary for it to be here, and it's not unplayable. It's just the weakest link in a world where the puzzles and level designs can be really strong. It's a good thing then that my favorite parts of this game have nothing to do with any enemy whatsoever. Let's finally talk about what Silent Hill 2's gameplay does right. I think its overall gameplay loop outside of combat is fantastic. There are 3 stages in Silent Hill 2's progression: traveling to an area, exploring that area, and then finally visiting that area's otherworld. With one exception, this pattern holds up for most of the game's runtime. This could seem formulaic, but I didn't really catch on to this pattern until the game was already over. It kept things fresh because just as you're getting to explore an area and feel like you have it down, the otherworld changes things up and then you're moving on to a new area. Whether that's a deserted apartment building or an underground prison, things never got too tiring. This first part, the traveling to new areas, is probably my least favorite part of this cycle. It's interesting to see the world around you, but it's very much going from point A to point B. There's very little functional gameplay here other than combat sprinkled on the way to your next destination. It's eye candy until the next area, and then you can play the game again. At least the eye candy is really good eye candy. This game is a visual treat, and every single thing you look at is detailed and some of it even has meaning, but we'll get to that a bit later. I found that the only time I loved the traveling sections was when Maria was with you. This is when you first meet her and you are captivated by her. Who is this person joining me? Why does she look like my dead wife? She then has some dialogue in this small section where you make it through a motel, and that offers a break from walking all the way across town. It's a good example of how to keep a player entertained. When a character has dialogue that keeps you engaged, suddenly all this boring walking has a purpose. And it's one that I wish stuck around a bit longer since Maria isn't always around. In fact, there's this very long section where you're going from point A to point B, and it's right after you lose Maria for the first time, and I found it to be a rude awakening to go back to traveling with just James. It solidified that having 2 characters interact to fill a space of aimless walking is a tried and true method of keeping a player engaged. The next step in the gameplay cycle of Silent Hill 2 is exploring these big giant areas. When you get to said point B, you have a maze to explore and solve. This is my favorite part of the gameplay. The best way to describe areas that you will navigate is that they are like a hub for puzzles. Exploring and braving enemies will reward you with pieces to these puzzles. Solving them will progress you further until you stumble upon even more puzzles. Repeat until you finish the area, and repeat within the areas until you finish the game. For example, let's say your goal is to get to a room, but to get the key to that room, the game requires you to collect 3 figures around the map, and those 3 figures are scattered throughout the surrounding area. Each figure has their own keys, items, or challenges that you have to collect or complete. It's like a domino effect of unlocking doors and gathering items. Puzzles can be complex and make you think. There's plenty scattered around that make you explore the map fully, which makes the game feel a bit less linear. The only way I can really describe the puzzles in this game is that they feel like they belong in this world. They narratively match up with the overall tone and story. For example, a highlight is the coin puzzle in the apartment. You have to rearrange coins to match a creepy puzzle that is about assigning blame to a person in a relationship. Some delicious foreshadowing, and a good marriage between gameplay and story. Finally, we then head to the other world. Think of this as a supernatural world that is only identical in format, with many more enemies and terrifying scenarios. The other world is often a much more linear experience than the bigger areas that this terrifying world is based on. There are a few puzzles, but it's not like an open maze. It's usually very linear, with the path forward being very obvious. It's a nice change of pace. It's still maze-like, but in a very different way. While there's one way forward, the playable area twists and turns, which creates an atmosphere of confusion and being lost. I found this section to also have the most combat, which normally with a combat system like this, I would really dislike, but the visual storytelling and there still being good puzzles lifts these sections up high enough to where it is more than tolerable to play through. Now, not every area and subsequent otherworld is a winner. The labyrinth made me want to throw my controller, eject my disc, snap it in half, and then slip in the disc of Resident Evil 4 because it was so frustrating to play. The labyrinth's layout is unique, but the enemies there are nothing but annoying, and it's a bit too linear with corridors that are too tight for too long. It comes just after the prison, which did this idea of crowded horror much better and less irritatingly. On the opposite end of the spectrum, downtown at the very beginning of the game is a bit of a bore since the explorable shops can be few and far between and very stretched out, plus only one enemy type and one weapon and one puzzle across 4 or 5 shops makes this area feel like a demo to the full game. It's not horrible, but it pales in comparison to what comes afterwards. But barring these 2 exceptions, every area is designed very well, the 2 highlights for me being the hospital and the hotel. Shout out to the prison though for being the most creative. You can tell when a horror game is designed well by not noticing that you're backtracking throughout the same areas, when you are focusing on collecting everything you can, solving puzzles, and dodging enemies. I found myself roaming all throughout these wonderfully detailed and planned areas. In every room is a new horror, whether it's some creepy trap laid by an enemy or a puzzle or 2 that sets the right tone. Many horror games get this wrong, where it's more about the scares that the enemies provide rather than the environmental storytelling, and honestly, I'm a bit surprised this game got it right. Puzzles and exploration are the most important part, and the game demands that you use your brain for it, which I am very thankful for. If you're not super familiar with this genre, this gameplay flow might sound a bit difficult. Having to juggle combat, exploration, and puzzles is in most games, but not with a layer of fear within it. Good thing that you're not completely without help. The game scatters little hints in the form of collectible notes offering some sort of location or clue to a puzzle. James will then mark down on the in-game map the point of interest. This system of offering clues in the world around you feels natural, and I find this to be a nice balance between leaving it completely up to you to figure out exactly what you need to do next, and holding your hand so closely that it destroys the best part of this game. If I were to personally adjust the balance between these 2, I would say that there should be a bit fewer clues to what you should do. Puzzles like using weights to open doors is something that has just the right amount of clues. Marking these doors down is good and helpful, yet I learned to unlock them myself. In contrast, the hospital has one too many clues for its various open-ended objectives. I only have 3 complaints for how exploration functions. The first is that it never gets more difficult when you're moving between area to area. Besides the apartment, you could swap the puzzles in the hospital, prison, hotel, and labyrinth, and you wouldn't notice a difference between how difficult they are to solve. This is a big ask of the game and is largely subjective, but I thought that most of the areas, specifically the hotel, would have benefited from having more puzzles that demanded more brain power from me. The second is that if you miss something very obvious, like really obvious, there's no way to tell. Something like a key sitting out will not be marked down, so when I miss something like that, it's like finding a needle in a haystack to recover it. Resident Evil 2 solves this by marking uncleared rooms with a dark color on your map, meaning that there's still something there for you to find. Once cleared, it will turn brighter. I know I just complained about there being too many clues, but I'm complaining about both sides of the pendulum. The game needs a happy middle between these 2 critiques. The third is that we as the player can't mark up the map itself. I would have loved to make some of the notes myself, and if that was expected of me, the experience could have been elevated even more. I remember in my first playthrough of the original Resident Evil, I made notes on things that potentially mattered, and it felt amazing when I looked at my notes and connected 2 and 2 together on what I needed and what I should do next. It was a eureka moment that I think this game could have used. So where exactly does this leave us for how Silent Hill 2 plays? I tore into the combat, but praised the level design barring a few complaints. Well, I'll put it this way. If you are like me, where exploration and puzzle solving are really important and the main ingredient to what makes a successful survival horror game, I can recommend this game with only a few caveats. You will have to ignore the poor combat that you would potentially be bothered by. If you are not like me, and a good combat experience is essential to any game that you play, regardless of genre, you will have some significant difficulties enjoying this game. Again, the game's combat isn't awful, it's just boring, but I know for some people that's even worse. Critical thinking is a key part of any successful game. This is true for Silent Hill 2, but you only find it in certain places, specifically in how you interact with the world. Combat is divorced from that and boils down to basic pattern recognition that doesn't get any more complex than predicting opponents' movements and punishing them for whiffing. So, not exactly glowing praise from me, and while I have played plenty of worse games, I think there are too many flaws that Silent Hill 2 has for it to earn any serious praise. But I said this game is special. Usually for most people, gameplay is the most important thing. If a story is bad but the gameplay is fun, you can still enjoy the game in many different ways. But if the story is good while being unbearable to play, I find this to be a much worse outcome. It's much harder to stomach bad gameplay than to stomach a bad story. Silent Hill 2 has a very lopsided gameplay experience. That is undeniable. But I think that this story is incredible and carries all other aspects of the game. I also recognize that the story isn't structured like a typical story at all, and yet I think the game is all the better for it. This story is the best story in a horror game I've played, but it's also very unconventional, and I don't think its structure is for everyone.
Silent Hill 2's most prominent strength is its unique approach to storytelling and characters. Instead of going for a super prevalent, overarching narrative with twists and turns at every step of the way, it turns its focus inward. There's plenty of the town to explore and tons of creepy encounters, but that's not what really matters. The little moments in between these big set pieces of gameplay and these large explorable areas are what matters the most and leave the largest amount of impact. The first encounter with the Pyramid Head is a really well done scene. There's plenty of tension, and I think many people will say this is what Silent Hill or horror is about and what it should be about. I disagree completely, because that quick moment you catch a breather with Maria at Heaven's Night, which reveals so much about both James and her, is infinitely more interesting than any other cutscene featuring Pyramid Head, Abstract Daddy, or anything spooky. It's even more interesting than any combat scenario or even any puzzle, and this applies to every character in this game. This is the main reason why Silent Hill 2 is special. You're learning who these characters are in the little cutscenes that play out. It's this overt character-focused storytelling combined with the environmental storytelling that creates Silent Hill 2's biggest strength. But before we get into specific plot details or character studies, I would regret not pointing out how incredible the game's visual and audible storytelling is. Whether that's a very deliberate reference to a plot point or a bunch of background objects that hold no gameplay relevance, or the truly amazing score to this game, each adds to a sense of tone that help Silent Hill 2 accomplish its goal, which is to create a compelling world that elevates this almost 25-year-old story. And I'm having a hard time saying more about it, since I feel like I can't do it justice. There are so many minor examples of the game successfully managing and executing a steady tone that consistently fills you with unease and distrust. This first occurred when playing music from the jukebox in the bar. You get a deep sense of sadness behind all the fear and terror. Other examples of personal favorite moments and imagery are pictures that you can find on the walls or statues that you can find around the city. Art often feels like it has this innocent presentation with a sinister layer underneath. It is perhaps the most meaningful thing that humans can artificially produce, and this importance is why it's so scary. If you haven't played the game, you might be a bit skeptical. After all, how much harm can a background picture on a wall really do? And yet, looking around is one of the most terrifying things you can do in this game. Pictures of nurses that you know are going to be enemies, and faceless doctors that have undeniable ulterior motives. It feels like every detail is alluding to either the eventual big reveal that happens at the end of the game, or something sinister that you will come across. Most of the game's imagery is carefully planned around this, especially for the hints to the big reveal, and as someone who was spoiled about the ending before I even played the game, seeing the hints in the world around me was a special kind of treat. In this way, Silent Hill 2 is multifaceted to appeal to multiple audiences. While I can praise something like a background object or a painting all day long, none of this would really matter if the actual plot of Silent Hill 2 wasn't good. That sounds a bit crazy to say since it's one of the most famous video game stories of all time and is regarded as one of the best video game stories of all time, but sometimes things just don't age well. Something can be groundbreaking for the time and yet have no relevance whatsoever to the current landscape. Something can come along and completely outclass it, and it still plays its part in history. That's just art and the nature of history itself. It doesn't take away from what the game did, but some things are just better left to the past. So does this critically acclaimed story hold up? Absolutely. But not without a few things to talk through. Sorry for another mixed answer, but not only do I have to keep this video interesting, and you watching, there's a few moving parts to Silent Hill 2's narrative that make it a bit complex to talk about. Let's start with the basic premise. James gets a letter from his wife, who has been dead for 3 years, to come to a town called Silent Hill. So he goes to find her. In that journey, he has to uncover multiple mysteries, all revolving around why he is really there. And when he eventually finds Mary, things aren't quite how they seem. I personally find this game's story to be one of the most compelling I've played because it is an extremely character-focused story. This game is all about James. It is a character study on grief, loss, selfishness, and a conflict of the human spirit. It is about the ability to overcome tragedy and error. This is reflected in each and every character, which is a feat that is very impressive. It is a masterclass in knowing what to show and what not to show, as well as when to deliver and when to hold back. And it all combines to a story that I will remember till the day I die. It is everything a story should be: personal, heartbreaking, satisfying, and potentially rewarding. It 100% earns its reputation that the original laid the foundation for. But a story subject is only one important piece of two parts. How the story is presented is another important part of any game. I was worried that this story would be bogged down by poor execution. Anything is bad if the best parts don't come together well, but I can easily say that all these moving parts to Silent Hill 2 work like a clock. A lot of this game's plot is James roaming around a little bit, searching for Mary, and James just kind of follows the clues that the town of Silent Hill lays out for him. In this way, the overarching plot can really just be boiled down to 15 hours of trying to find Mary by discovering a bunch of dead ends and chasing after or following certain people who might know where she is. While this doesn't sound thrilling on paper, it's by following these characters that leads to moments that reveal more about themselves and more about James, which is the real bread and butter to this experience. You see, most stories have strengths and weaknesses. That's definitely not a secret, but something I think many people don't realize is that story structures, or how something is presented, can either elevate those strengths and weaknesses or snuff them out. If something like a Persona game where you spend time with a bunch of side characters has a really weak supporting cast, it's shooting itself in the foot by dedicating hours and hours of content into getting to know the shallow characters around you. A faster-paced RPG that spends less time on characters and more time on plot might be a better fit. Similarly, if that RPG has this amazing world around you, but you're railroaded into cutscenes and set pieces for most of the game, what's the point of having this amazing world building? I want to stop and smell the roses, but there's nothing like that to do. Small activities that you can do within the world and well-written side quests that focus on characters would have helped, but it's fetch quests all the way down. Considering those two examples, it's clear that a mismatched method to tell your story squanders its potential. Focusing back onto Silent Hill 2, I think a character-focused story where the overarching plot takes a back seat is perfect for a horror game. Caring about characters, in my opinion, is the best way to make a player scared. That's why the scariest games to me don't have very frequent checkpoints, or maybe it has a manual save system. I like it when it simulates being scared for your life. It's a good attempt to merge story and gameplay. You're going to play scared because you don't want to lose something you hold of value, your time. The ultimate story application of this gameplay principle that I just described is to have a character-focused story where you don't want the characters you care about to die. When something can be lost, like a character's life, that's when my brain starts caring and tries to avoid that loss at all times. This is especially true for the protagonist and playable characters. While you don't have the opportunity to play as any of the side characters in this game, playing as James I found to only increase my care for him. When the story starts to seep into the world around you and you buy into the illusion that your death when you play means the character's death, that's when horror games become special. Having a character-focused story creates certain horrors that are unique to the story structure. For example, interactions with characters are based on very little rhyme or reason. Angela will be in one location like the labyrinth, and then somehow make her way to the Hotel Otherworld when it took James a boat ride and a series of locked doors to get there. It adds an uneasiness to the atmosphere where the more you think about it, the more you have to reconcile with the thought that this town does not make sense at all. It's almost like it has its own wishes and its own rules, and that the characters are simply trapped in it at its will. It almost feels alive and with a purpose, and that is truly terrifying. On top of this supernatural uneasiness, there's also a mystery element to James' visit to Silent Hill, and that gives an additional layer to every conversation. During scenes where James and another character was talking, I asked myself two questions. What is the current character interaction saying about Angela or Eddie or Maria? And what is this revealing about James himself? Narratives emerge from these questions that lead to subtle storylines, and those subtle storylines enhance the main narrative in every possible way by providing parallels and comparisons. We'll get to that shortly, but the ultimate idea that we can see the most is that the people trapped here are utterly broken individuals. Along the way, James runs into a few faces that will keep popping up around the town. Our complete roll call of characters includes James himself, Maria, Angela, Laura, and Eddie. This small cast means that it feels like it doesn't have to stretch itself thin with multiple characters and multiple plots. Silent Hill called to each of them for a reason, and each of those reasons are thoroughly explored and give each character a sense of depth. Every payoff, both potentially happy and unavoidably tragic, is centered around the fates of our characters, and this is the beating heart of Silent Hill 2 that is far beyond the medium standard. That beating heart starts with James. James is a very complex character. He came to Silent Hill to find his wife, but throughout his journey to find his wife Mary, he instead meets a mysterious woman named Maria. She promises that she knows where Mary is, and James is forced to tag along with her for a while. To me, Maria represents the ideal and perverted version of Mary that James could never have. She looks very similar to Mary, has the same voice and face, but is more attractive, more sexual and seductive, and at James's beck and call. And while she manipulates him on many occasions, James is not free of guilt in whatever weird thing they have going on. Throughout the game, Maria will make suggestive comments towards him, and although he always resists in the end, he starts to look like he's ready to give in to those offers more and more. It's this situation and Maria that reveals the cornerstone of James's character, inner conflict. It's what makes James one of the best protagonists in gaming, because he actually feels like a character that struggles with his own thoughts and feelings. He isn't a self-insert that is a force for good. He isn't one-dimensional, and he isn't a hero that swoops in and saves the day. He is a broken and flawed man that lives his life in conflict, and his journey is about resolving it. Over the course of the game, and probably over the course of this video essay, there has been this looming but invisible conflict that James is trying to resolve. It's why Silent Hill keeps showing him monsters, because James's story doesn't make sense. In fact, his entire presence in this town makes no sense. After all, he's trying to find a wife that's already dead. Characters even call him out for being out of place, crazy, or being dishonest with himself. What's really going on here? Well, in case you didn't know one of the most famous video game twists of all time, James killed his wife. Mary was sick. Very sick, and she belittled and verbally abused him during their final days together. James ended up taking matters into his own hands. This completely changes James' character from the caring but confused husband that we thought he might be, to the glimpses in the mirror that James gets when he looks at Maria, Angela, or Eddie. I played the game knowing this twist, and I believed it enhanced my experience of this game. I could see every little clue, every subtle hint, every nudge in the direction that James isn't exactly what he seems. I think James' inner conflict is best encapsulated and resolved in the Leave ending, my personal favorite and what I consider to be the true ending of Silent Hill 2. In this ending, James sees Maria for who she is, a figment of James' selfish wants and needs. Despite Maria offering to be exactly what James wants, James recognizes that the charade has to end. Maria, whether she is a force of Silent Hill or an independent force in Silent Hill, needs to let go and stop trying to seduce James. Maria becomes the final boss. Once Maria is put down, James envisions one final word with Mary. She's sick, but is missing the abusive qualities that she had on her deathbed. In that same room he killed her in, he admits to killing Mary not out of mercy for her pain during her sickness, but because he wanted his life back. He was tired of taking care of a dying wife. In his own words, he hated her. Mary, lying on a hospital bed, dying, gives the perfect response and my favorite quote of the entire game.
If that's true, then why do you look so sad?
And in this question, I knew that Silent Hill 2 had depth. This one scene gives James so much character. It's in this ending that James reveals that he is not a horrible man. He did something horrible, but it completely broke him, and the storm of conflicting emotions that had been torturing him all this time. It is the driving force behind Silent Hill's tricks, and it is only when his resolve strengthens and he learns to own up and be honest with himself that he is truly free to leave this town. It is a masterclass in writing. The rest of this ending is James leaving with Laura, a young girl that you had been chasing across Silent Hill because of her connections to Mary. Mary's final letter to James is read, and in it she ultimately wishes James to live a life without her, and James' journey of forgiveness and putting grief aside is complete. Bravo, Silent Hill 2. Easily the best narrative in a survival horror game. And I'm gonna get a little silly here and say that I think this might be one of the best narratives in a video game ever. I can only think of a few that would contest this, and all of them have similar depth in their storytelling. And the best part is that the depth doesn't stop at just James, Maria, and Mary. It continues with the dynamics between James, Angela, and Eddie. There are two more main endings, and each of them is a complete gut punch, and yet adds so much to what this story can say. To see that, we have to first look at Angela and Eddie's stories. Angela is the most depressing character in the game, and yet my personal favorite. She is the first character we meet, and James finds her roaming in a graveyard where she tells him that she's looking for her mother. While this is a fairly normal but unsettling interaction, the next time we see her, she's playing with a very large, sharp knife. She's questioning the point of going on with her life. After talking her down from the proverbial ledge, James holds onto the knife that Angela had for her. It becomes a key item in your inventory. It's in this interaction that you learn two things. Angela has suicidal tendencies, and there's some serious trauma or mental damage that has happened to her. As the game progresses, we learn that her father had abused her when she was young. She ends up killing him because of this abuse. James tries to reach out with a helping hand multiple times, but Angela never accepts it, assuming that James only wants one thing. It's here that we arrive at the saddest aspect of this game. Angela's own violent actions are the consequences of the most horrible abuse that a human can go through. It is a tragedy that she has never learned to heal from something that she didn't deserve, despite what she tells herself. Her storyline culminates in one final interaction with James at the very end of the game. She's in a room with a burning staircase where she goes to talk to James. After confusing him with her mom, she quickly proceeds to mock James about his offer for help. She views James' offer for help as pity and views herself as too far beyond redemption. She sees no avenue in which James can heal her pain. She asks for her knife back. James refuses. She leaves James anyway while ascending a burning staircase being engulfed in flames. James makes a comment on the heat, to which Angela responds with this.
You see it too? For me, it's always like this.
Angela is unable to overcome the immense self-hatred she has for herself due to the abuse she suffered throughout all her life. It is one of the most tragic storylines in games. In fact, I find her story to be a very challenging moral to engage with. An inability to move past trauma will doom you. It shows the importance of seeking help and recognizing that self-pity and hatred will destroy you. It wasn't Angela's fault, and while this is very well-intentioned and mature, it seems callous and cold considering the subject matter, especially if the game is telling abuse victims the necessity of healing past some of the most unbearable moral atrocities. A charitable conclusion that I have come to is that the game is simply trying to highlight the need for healing, that even with the worst happening, there's an imperative to keep on living, and that's how I'm going to choose to interpret it. Eddie's tale is simpler, but still plays a very important role. When we first meet him, he comes off as a bit of a wimp. He's throwing up after seeing a dead body, screaming that he didn't kill the man in the other room. While James seems to believe him here, we slowly learn more and more about him, and that likely innocent perspective of Eddie changes pretty fast. His scenes become a lot more eerie as the game goes on, as more and more he shows his true colors. Eddie is a very violent man. There's this slow reveal that starts off with James overhearing that Eddie is running from the police, progressing to Eddie becoming violent and dangerous, and ends with Eddie dying by James' own hands because Eddie attacked James. Before they have their fight, Eddie tells James one important piece of information.
Don't get all holy on me, James. This town called you too. Yeah, you and me are the same. We're not like other people, don't you know that?
The important aspect of Eddie's character that we see throughout his time at Silent Hill is that he is selfish and blames his violent actions on other people. He refuses to see how flawed he is, and while he believes his bullies deserve to be harmed, nothing ever justifies that behavior. This results in him spiraling into a selfish and violent psychopath and meets an end befitting of one. It's through these two characters, Angela and Eddie, that James is shown versions of himself. In these subtle interactions, James desperately wants to help both of them, but is somewhat hesitant to do so. He tries his best, but in the end they both refuse his help and are doomed for it. Angela walks away from James, and up a flame-filled staircase never to be seen again. In contrast, Eddie's interactions take a horrifying and violent turn. He was a spiteful man, blind to his own guilt, and James eventually has to kill him. They are tragic stories that contribute to one of the most interesting parts of the narrative. Both characters end up claiming that James is, deep down, similar to them. Eddie says it outright, while Angela asks if James is saving her knife for himself. And depending on the ending you get, they're correct. How James grows and changes from his visit in Silent Hill depends on various factors we will get into later, but both bad endings parallel both Angela and Eddie's journeys. In the in-water ending, after his fight with Maria, James drowns himself in the lake due to the overwhelming guilt of killing his wife. He never gets to leave with Laura. He does not honor his wife's dying wish to live. James becomes no different than Angela and is unable to move past the grief and trauma that occurred in his life. In the Maria ending, instead of fighting Maria as the final boss, you fight Mary, and you end up leaving Silent Hill with Maria. James becomes no different than Eddie and believes that his murder of Mary is justified. Some say that this is best shown in the ending cutscene where he appears callous towards Maria, but I think James's selfishness is best shown in the scene before. While talking to Mary, James is still making excuses for killing her, believing that he did her a favor, all while selfishly getting close to and preferring Maria. These two James in these bad endings are so starkly contrasted to the care and love underneath the hate that James had for his wife in the Leave ending. These differences are so overt that putting in some extra time into getting all three main endings was worth it. In this way, playing Silent Hill 2 is like exploring which side of James is going to win. Will it be the shadow of the loving husband that felt sorry for what he did? Will it be the despairful man that drives into a lake to kill himself because he has no idea what to do other than to let the flames consume him? Or will James be a monster that chooses to forget what is important and leaves behind everything, becoming selfishly obsessed with a woman who most likely isn't even real? While I can continue on and break down every little detail in this story, there are other videos by other people that do that better, and I feel a little underqualified to do so anyways since I haven't played the original or even the first Silent Hill. The game has so much depth to it, much further than I dived, and I don't think I could possibly do it justice. I've covered the main themes that I got from the game, and if you can and want to, I highly encourage you to play it for yourself. It's one of those games where, even if you know what the exact story beats are and when they happen, you're going to get something out of it. So far, I have only been showering this game's story in praise. Why then do I say that my recommendation is a bit complicated? That ties into the intro and nature of this video, and it has to do with personal preference, particularly your subjective experience with video games that come before. Personally, I like a little bit of ambiguity in stories, not to the point of spouting nonsense to confuse you and lead you around in circles, but a smart teasing that you don't necessarily know everything and won't get all the answers. I especially like this in horror stories. Silent Hill 2 is full of these little teases, and this is a very subjective thing to like or dislike, along with plenty of room for opinions on its execution. For example, many people praised Alan Wake 2's story and ending because of the twists and turns that lead you to an open-ended conclusion. But I disliked where Alan Wake 2's ending goes, and the farther removed I am from that game, the more I realized that it soured a lot of the narrative experience for me, because the game's plot is very intentionally structured like a detective show, and that kind of plot hinges on a reveal that makes a lot of sense, and it requires a satisfying ending. Alan Wake 2's ending is more ambiguity and more riddles to solve. Remedy's storytelling is a rabbit hole that never ends. This really works for some people, but I think it's non-committal writing that eats itself alive. Silent Hill 2 is somewhat similar, but with one key difference. It gives you the answers and the conclusions where it matters the most. Yet it is true that most of the game's finer details are only alluded to. To catch what actually happens and the story of most characters, you have to infer a lot, including the nature of Silent Hill, and even some characters' fates. For example, why James goes to Silent Hill has to be inferred and theorized through context clues. There's no definitive right answer that the game gives you. I've seen people speculate that he went there to drown himself with Mary's body, or that he simply showed up out of guilt. I lean towards the former because it contrasts Angela's story better, and you can find a body-shaped blanket in the car at the beginning. Speaking of Angela, another example of a confusion I had is that I assumed Angela forever spiraled deeper into Silent Hill, ascending a burning staircase into nowhere, trapped in her own nightmare forever. It represented her inability to break from her habit of self-loathing, when in reality she wanders off to die by her own hand, confirmed by the game's original writer. I personally like my version better. It's these small intricacies that leave so much up to interpretation where if you have ideas on what happens that are inaccurate, or if you're used to the usual straightforward, by the book's video game story, there's a good chance that you won't get much out of it as I did, or plenty of other people did. There's not even a good explanation for Laura. The entire character is a contradiction due to how she interacts with the town. Part of me thinks that she sees Silent Hill completely empty and instantly because she has no guilt, trauma, or sin for the town to feed off, but is physically present in the same world that James is, meaning that she most likely would be in the same reality and world that he is in, which is the messed up version of Silent Hill. That ultimately means that within Silent Hill, two realities can exist at once, which means that maybe what James is seeing isn't reality at all, which gets into questioning what's real and what's not. When you get there, things get really messy since it's easy for tricks of perception to rob a story of significance. And what's the deal with Maria? Is she real? Is she a monster? She turns into one at one point. Does she become a human during her ending? All these are confusing, and there's a lack of clarity here, and again, that's on purpose. There is no strict answer, and we have to use our brains, something that isn't really called upon much in video game stories. And while I think that's what makes it special and interesting, others that prefer straightforward storytelling and like their mysteries to be completely 100% solved may hate this and nitpick it into the ground. Similarly, remember when I said that I loved when characters just showed up randomly and nonsensically? Well, if you're the kind of person that wants an explanation for everything, you're constantly going to be asking how the hell did you get here, and you're going to have to suspend your disbelief in this way. Angela and Eddie making their way around the town and its darkest depths makes zero sense, and while I did not find it to be that big of a deal since the entire town doesn't make sense, picky people will be picky. There is no explanation for how all these characters are teleporting around. In fact, no explanation is one of the more common ways you can describe Silent Hill 2. The game only explains the bare minimum and leaves the rest of the questions up to your imagination. This could be the game's biggest strength to some, but also its biggest weakness. One final thing that may bother people and might be a pretty big deal breaker is that the dialogue is all over the place, not in quality, but in conversational topics. It's very poetic and can be hard to follow. Characters jump from one topic to the next cryptically without rhyme or reason, which sets a great tone but comes at the cost of realism. People don't actually talk in riddles to each other all the time. In fact, I found some of the best dialogue in the game to be between Maria and James because that's when this happens the least. I like the ideas and the symbolism with Angela, but I can see how dialogue can be frustrating and interpreted as all smoke and no substance. Silent Hill 2's narrative is complex and gripping. It is easily the biggest strength of the entire game and single-handedly carries all other aspects of this game. So far, I have been mixed on the gameplay and yet glowing on the story. If we were to stop the review here, I would overall say that Silent Hill 2 is an unpolished game worth every minute of your time, and while nothing really is going to alter that conclusion too strongly, Silent Hill 2 is hiding one final aspect that we haven't talked about yet, and I think it's worth exploring. There's one final piece on why I think Silent Hill 2 is contentious, and that's the game's ending system. To clarify, I don't think the actual endings themselves are contentious, but the way you get those endings are. In this way, Silent Hill 2 is wholly unique. The best way to describe Silent Hill 2's system for achieving endings is that the game tries to psychologically evaluate you and what you desire. But before we get into the specifics of how this works, let's talk a bit about choices. Most games handle choices very overtly. Games sometimes let you know when choices are being made that have potential ramifications later. The most obvious example of this is a game from Telltale. Take The Wolf Among Us. You choose to say something and a character will remember what you said and take a different action than if you said a different option. It's a cool way to personalize a journey. Something similar happens in Mass Effect. There's so many layering dialogue choices that my Shepard isn't going to be the same as your Shepard, and that's what makes Mass Effect special. It can react to who I am through big and small moments. It doesn't do this perfectly, but what it does do is offer an experience personalized just well enough to make it fun and unique. Overt choices like these are very common in RPGs. They are a very simple way to offer players freedom in a story. Not everything the player says or chooses has to have this massive impact. Sometimes having it be your choice is good enough. Overall, I like these kinds of choices in games, but I always felt like they were destined to be surpassed. The choices you make in video games can include a very overt story choice, and for most games that's all that matters. But choices in video games technically includes choices you make in gameplay, like how you're going to attack, if you're going to engage or run away, if you're going to use one weapon over the other, maybe what class you are going to use, and what characters you will spend the most time with. Silent Hill 2 takes these into account. The game measures your gameplay choices, which means that you're judged on your own freedom. You can get a few different outcomes based on how you play, and some of the choices to these endings you may not even realize are choices. In fact, what determines your ending ends up being pretty wild. So bear with me here while I try to describe all the reasons as to why someone may get one ending over the other. Okay, so there are three endings: Leave, In Water, and Maria. Leave is the best one that I think is the canon one, where you take Laura and leave Silent Hill. In Water is the most depressing one, that ends in James driving his car into the water with him in it, and Maria ends with leaving Silent Hill with Maria. But how do you get these? The general idea behind each of these routes is the following. If you avoid conflict and stay healthy while keeping Mary in mind, you get the Leave ending. If you seek out conflict and are prone to violence, constantly at low health, and have Mary in mind, you get the In Water ending. Finally, if you buy into the illusion of Silent Hill and have Maria in mind, then you get the Maria ending. There are at least a dozen factors that contribute to an ending, and while not all of your choices have to line up perfectly to which ending you want to get, you're going to need to choose correctly a majority of the time, which is easier said than done. First, Leave requires you to not be at low health and have a low number of enemy kills throughout the game. Okay, simple enough. Heal when hurt, and try to run past enemies if you can. But on top of that, make sure you answer the puzzles correctly. During the mirror puzzle, when the writing on the wall inquires about the nature of Silent Hill, you have to choose the rotten apple instead of the ripe one. When giving the 2 eggs from the pyramid heads and the ability to go through 2 doors, choose the rusty one. Furthermore, do not look at Angela's knife more than a few times, do not interact with Maria more than necessary, and inspect Mary's photo multiple times during your run, and take Mary's photo with you past the elevator where you have to leave all your stuff behind. And by doing this, you might get the Leave ending. Second, for the In Water ending, you'll have to pick fights and be at low health for a significant amount of time, stomp on enemies that are already dead for a significant amount of time, and kill a lot of enemies in general. Okay, simple enough. Only heal when necessary and kill everything in sight. But on top of that, make sure you answer the puzzles correctly. Pick the rotten apple and the rust-colored egg like the Leave ending. Also, just take out Angela's knife as many times as you can. Spam inspecting it until you are tired of doing so, and then spam it some more. Also, avoid Maria at all costs, and if you're lucky, you might get the In Water ending. Finally, if you're wanting to leave with Maria, stick to her like glue and interact with her whenever possible. See everything there is to see in Heaven's Night. Simple. Just talk to her a bunch. Spend time with her. Get to know her. But there's more. Choose the ripe apple and the crimson egg as opposed to the rotten apple and the rust egg in the puzzles from the other endings. Furthermore, do not look at Angela's knife, do not look at Mary's photo, do not look at Mary's letter, and do not, by any means, forget to check on Maria when she leaves James alone in the hospital and the labyrinth. Get all that? Because that's Silent Hill 2's ending system, and I think you get the point. If I'm being honest, I simultaneously love this system and think it is a hot mess. I love it because when this works, it feels natural. It limits this weird separation that most games have between gameplay and story. For some games, nothing much matters outside of a cutscene. The biggest offender of this, that is more common than I would like, is when your main character is winning a fight against a boss, but after that fight is done, a cutscene will play out where you get your ass whooped into the ground. It's in this way that gameplay and story aren't playing nice with each other. One has to throw the other out the window, while said window flyer crawls back into the building and throws the other out in return. They actively betray each other back to back, but not in Silent Hill 2. Suddenly, everything matters to James. There are very few actions that he can take that won't contribute to his character development, and therefore, ending. This is not only a special thing in itself, but the experience you gain by this actually working well in a few scenarios is a highlight in my gaming career. In other words, when how the game wants to perceive an action and how you perceive that same action match up, it is truly incredible. For example, there's this section in the motel where you have to leave your things behind and take nothing with you as you descend into an area where you have to explore without any weapons. You leave behind all your stuff in boxes, and the elevator measures your weight to determine if you have put all your weapons in the locker. I wanted to know if I can take something small, like Mary's photo with me, and I left everything in the room with the elevator but the photo, and it worked. It felt like I was choosing to carry Mary with me, and I wasn't ever going to let that photo out of my sight. The leave ending that I got felt earned from that moment specifically. It's a perfect example of the power of trusting the player to make certain choices that may be outside the box. We, as players, can be dumb sometimes, but we can also be really smart when you force us to make intuitive and natural choices that rely on being fully immersed in a world. However, the fundamental reason why this system also sucks is that the small choices and measures can be interpreted in multiple ways. The choices that you make with the puzzles, where you choose between 2 apples and 2 eggs, are like a traditional choice in a video game. You're basically choosing the nature of what James believes Silent Hill is like, if it's rotten and rusty or if it's ripe and shiny. I'm not talking about those specifically, I think they're done really well. It's the more subtle ones, like how much you look at Angela's knife, how much you check on Maria, and how much you interact with her, if you run away from danger or if you can stay at low health for a certain amount of time. These all can be interpreted from a purely gameplay perspective and not a story one. That, or maybe the story implications are so implied that it ultimately feels cheap. For example, one of the requirements for the Maria ending is to check on her often and interact with her as much as possible. I think it's assumed that if the player interacts with her, there would be more interest in her over Mary, but I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss any dialogue on my first playthrough. I was also interested in Maria's dialogue since this was the most we have seen of 2 characters interacting, and it was the best part of the game for a while, so I was around her far more than I should have been. And while I didn't get the ending on my first playthrough because I answered the riddles in the opposite way, I would have if I answered them correctly, because that's what I went back and did. I reloaded an old save and went to choose the other answers in the puzzles, and I got the Maria ending without doing anything else. A similar thing happened with Angela's knife. When I learned that this was a contributing factor to the ending you got, I was shocked that I didn't get the leave ending on my first playthrough, because I took the knife out twice. So, why did I do this? Despite what the game thinks, it was not because I wanted to use it on myself. I will guarantee you that. It was because I thought to myself, what does this knife do? And I took it out of my pocket and looked at it. And when I put it away, I took it back out again because I thought to myself, hey, maybe I missed something important. And I continued to look at it, admiring how shiny it was. Really symbolic of me to want death by thinking that I might have missed a detail on an item that was marked as a key item. Finally, this extended to the smallest of ending requirements, like fighting off enemies instead of running. I wanted to be thorough in killing any enemies that were around me, not because James was full of bloodlust, but because I never knew when I had to come back to this room. If I ever had to return, I didn't want to back myself into a corner. This is a game that has a strong narrative, but it is also a game that you can lose by taking too much damage. And I don't want to lose this game, so it would make sense that I would want to avoid any sort of scenario where I would be put at a disadvantage. Maybe by not killing an enemy walking down the hallway, I would run into them later, during a time where I wouldn't have as many supplies as I do now, so it would be harder. Or maybe by not killing that enemy at the current time, I was keeping enemies on the map that could potentially corner me later if I ever had to move through that area again. Basically, I only sought out fights to improve my long-term survival chances, which is more in line with the leave ending storyline for James than anything else. There are dozens of reasons to never delay a combat encounter, and running away is difficult enough as it is. I think I would fix this system by implementing the most important choices be a mix between overt choices and natural gameplay ones. For example, take this final nurse enemy in the hallway during the end of the game. Maybe something the game could measure is if you rushed in to try to attack it before it could die. This would measure your personality while not having any of those weird limitations on playstyle that could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Creating specific scenarios and testing your reactions to them is a much more satisfying way to earn your ending, kind of like keeping the photo with you in the elevator. To me, that's more of a sign of me wanting to see your dead wife again than not killing an enemy that is a real threat to you later. Same thing for not healing. You have 2 healing resources, a bottle that heals a small portion of your overall health, and the syringe that heals all wounds. The syringe is obviously more valuable since it instantly heals you to full health, but there are levels to low health where the bottle only heals a little bit. This encourages you to flirt with death as much as possible. A full heal from the first tier of low health uses 1 syringe. A full heal from the final and lowest tier of low health uses 1 syringe. Using a bottle just to get to full health is potentially wasteful when you can use 1 syringe to make up for 3 or 4 bottles. It just isn't ever optimal to use the bottles first. With that being said, even accounting for all the ways the system falls short, a story that reacts to these kinds of gameplay decisions is very brave and not something that's done in our current era of gaming. A more streamlined choice system is more common, and that makes sense. Measuring such subtle ways to adjust an ending puts a great deal of faith in the player that most games don't have. I don't trust that the public perception of this ending system would be so positive if it wasn't carried by its namesake. That's because there's a sense of trust in Silent Hill 2, that its story is at the top of the industry, which it is, but that trust in the story translates to thinking you will deserve the ending you get. While I think games need to take more risks like this ending system, it's definitely flawed, and it was a toss-up on if it made me feel more immersed or if I was left scratching my head. But when it worked, with how the game presented its choices and consequences in the narrative, it made me feel more immersed than any other game. And that's important to me, and something that is getting harder and harder to do as the medium becomes more about keeping players hooked rather than immersive storytelling. So it's not completely without value. In fact, it has quite a bit. Silent Hill 2 is a game that came out in 2024. It is also a game that came out in 2001, and while I haven't played the original game, I know that many of the positive elements that I talked about are present within the original game as well. What's odd is that those qualities feel like they belong in 2024, and in some ways, feel innovative today. It might be the biggest reason why the remake was so successful. This story, this town, these themes, these characters. The critical reception for the original was spot on. Each aspect of the story was ahead of its time. And while massive amounts of credit is due to the team over at Blooper for executing this remake so well, there's just something about the original ideas from 2001 that are above and beyond other video games. Silent Hill 2 can often feel like it gets bogged down by a few mistakes and poor design choices. Gameplay is hit or miss with great exploration and subpar combat that's interesting for maybe a third of the game's runtime. The story was one of the best stories I've played in a game, and yet I don't doubt that it will be difficult for some to enjoy. And the ending system is well-meaning and has the highest highs of the game, but it's confusing more often than it is immersive. But these negative qualities are as unique to Silent Hill 2 as the positive ones. I think the best way to sum up my thoughts of the game is to recall what actually happened in my playthrough. I completed the game and got 3 of the 8 endings possible. I got all 3 main endings by reloading my saves and changing some of the decisions I made throughout my playthrough because I valued the story that much. But in order to get the other 3 original endings and the 2 new ones, I would need to go through New Game Plus a few times and embrace the same boring gameplay that overstayed its welcome for a bit of my original playthrough. I tried to, and I started, but quickly stopped since I realized it wasn't worth it. Which makes me sad because I really want to experience these endings. Maybe one day I will, just not in the near future. Early last year, I made a video about Silent Hill: The Short Message. I tried to find the positives in that short experiment, but they were so few and far between that I thought there wasn't much worth saving for the next game. In fact, I chalked the entire game up to getting experience for people who were passionate about Silent Hill. A practice project. Silent Hill has always interested me, partly because of the critical reception of the originals, and I was worried I wouldn't ever get to experience a good Silent Hill game, a new one. I judged the future of Silent Hill by its most recent entry, and I think that's fair. Right now, I will do the same thing. If the future of Silent Hill is about very enclosed spaces with clunky combat, limited enemy design, a poor balance in the relationship between the world and its enemies, and confusing ending systems, then I don't think I am going to enjoy what the franchise has to offer moving forward. Silent Hill 2 will be the lone entry in this franchise that I like. If the future of Silent Hill is about complex characters, an incredible narrative, a horrifyingly detailed world, and gameplay systems that enhance a story instead of hinder it, then the Silent Hill franchise has the incredible and rare potential to do something special. tell stories that are mature, complex, and compelling in a medium that so desperately needs good writing. And if Silent Hill manages to do that, it would make me happy.
James, you made me happy.